Well, that went a little different than I expected. Nvidia's GTC keynote, GTC being the GPU technology conference, where they kind of self-host their own announcement show and things like that, started this week, and they just had their big keynote about their new graphics cards and all the technology that they're pushing with it. And we got the announcement of the RTX 4090 at $1,600. And then we also got the 4080, which comes in 16 and 12 gigabyte VRAM variants, starting at $899, and I believe the 12 gigabyte one is, or the 16 gigabyte one is $1299. Those are some beefy GPUs, but they're touting some pretty insane performance. The 4090, of course, has 24 gigs of VRAM, just like the 3090 and the Titan RTX, but they're touting some incredible speeds for these things, and the 4090 specifically is supposed to launch October 12th. Let's talk about streaming stuff before we talk about the other things going on, since that's most relevant to my audience, but there's a lot to talk about here. First of all, with streaming, they didn't actually talk about it during the keynote thing. They cut pretty much everything related to content creation just to focus on AI and robotics, because Nvidia is all in on that side of things. Seems to be where their money's coming from. You could also read it as Nvidia on the whole thinking that streaming is less important these days. Streaming is dead or something like that, but I think it's just more GTC kind of focuses on those more hardcore things. We will have some more press events and editors events and things like that over the next few days, where we'll get a little bit more information and things like that, so I'll save that for our future coverage of the actual card once I get my hands on it. The product page for it gives confirmation that we do have an AV1 encoder on the RTX 4000 series graphics cards. We kind of already knew this by assumption, but this is official confirmation. But more importantly, I think, since we did kind of already assume that, the card has dual encoders. So this is kind of similar to how the Pascal, the 10 series and older cards tended to, or at least the 10 series cards had dual NVENC chips on them, which allowed for more ongoing H.264 encode sessions at the same time. This is a similar setup, except now at the driver level, those two separate encoder chips can now be used to encode the same frame or to encode the same video stream at a faster rate, up to 2 times faster, by splitting up the frame into halves at the intake of the bit stream and then, you know, encoding them on the separate chips and combining them at the end of the bit stream back into one video file, which is absolutely massive. Kind of competes with Intel's hyper-encode stuff using the iGPU and the dedicated GPU together, and has some potential for some wild implications in the future that haven't been developed yet, but I see a lot of potential for that. So I'm very excited to see where that goes. And as far as I can tell so far, that applies to AV1 as well as H.264 and HEVC, and also unlocks 8K 60 encoding, both in Shadowplay, GeForce Experience Share, as well as OBS Studio once it's implemented, which is absolutely awesome. That has been a big limitation, and I know 8K isn't everyone's priority, but that extra speed trickles down into other benefits later on. And of course, they did mention they have an AV1 encoder running on their GPU, which they are citing at 40% more bitrate efficient based on their testing than H.264. We'll have to play with it and see, because again, all hardware encoder implementations differ. There's a lot to go into that and play with it. So there's a lot to dissect once we get hands-on, but that is very exciting. And they also announced that AV1 encoding is coming to OBS soon. They projected a timeline. I don't want to hold anyone to that timeline, but it's coming out in the next OBS update, as well as a couple other features we're talking about are coming out in the next OBS update. But it's also AV1 encoding is coming to Discord video calls and video streaming as well, which is really exciting, as well as Topaz Labs. One thing that I did observe through the documentation and what I've heard and things like that, is that the dual encoding still requires some implementation on the software side, because it runs in the driver, so it's not going to be an automatic thing. So applications that haven't updated for it will not get to take advantage of the dual encoders. That means you'll still be encoding AV1, H.264, whatever, at the capabilities, quality level that the card can, but you don't get the added speed boost or whatever, which I guess is fine. The RTX background removal with the new cards gets an update that now uses temporal sampling, which means it samples through time. So random objects that appear in your frame for a moment won't just flash in and out of the view. They'll be masked out with some degree of accuracy, which will make for a much better background removal or background replacement, blurring, whatever process, which is really cool. A new feature is now face expression estimation, which is going in line with all their video conferencing, where they're gonna fake your face for a lot of this kind of features, but it's actually getting implemented into VTube Studio. So VTubers will have an easier time with acceleration for interpreting their faces to apply to their VTuber models, the little virtual avatars, which is really cool. We have a lot of content planned diving into that side of things. We'll get to as time allows. However, this doesn't apply to those of you who use the little head-mounted iPhone strategy, but maybe it'll reduce the need for people to use that strategy, because that just seems very uncomfortable. They also have new eye contact technology that they're going to target. They've advertised it before for video conferencing, but it looks like they're targeting now for like podcasts and things like that. That's where we might get into weird uncanny valley stuff that I don't know if everyone will appreciate, but it's an option available to you. Not streaming specific, but content creation specific at least. They stated that using the object select mask, basically the AI rotoscoping in Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve, sees a 70% performance increase on RTX 40 series graphics cards due to all the new AI and tensor-based improvements in the architecture, which is absolutely wild, and I can't wait to play with that, because currently it is kind of slow, even on my 3090 and Titan RTX. And then, of course, we get to the new ray tracing RTX implementation and stuff in the first place, in that they have a new architecture, they have faster tensor cores, they have more of them and new types of them to accelerate different workflows. They showed off a Racer X demo, which was a cool thing where everything in the game was simulated, including, you know, the lighting, the physics, the particles, and all of that, and says that it runs, I think, 3 to 4 times faster on RTX 40 series cards than 30 series, just as a tech demo, which is pretty cool. They are all in on neural processing, so that is where the architecture is going. They're on a new 4 nanometer process, which means significantly, like, a lot more transistors than they fit on the Ampere one, so a lot more processing power for your space, and 2 times power efficiency than Ampere, supposedly, which doesn't exactly line up with all the crazy power draw requirement things that have been going through the speculation rumor mill, so we'll see how that goes. I think Jensen said at stock clocks, the RTX 40 series and 30 series power draw is supposed to be comparable. So we'll see. That's still been a whole big up in the air thing, and it uses a new PCIe 16 or 18 pin power connector for the new ATX spec. And otherwise you'll need 4 8-pin adapters to convert to it, which is just wild. So good luck. Also, the card itself is chunky as hell. It's almost a 4-slot card, which is going to block off a lot of slots. Although you can still get it water blocked and make it the size of like a movie case. So I'm really frustrated by GPUs blocking my slots, and I can't get PCIe risers that actually fit below, you know, graphics cards that work. So that part's getting kind of frustrating, but it is a beefy card. The neural processing improvement comes in the form of a new feature, which is called shader execution reordering, which means it's able to do its kind of tensor core processing and GPU processing out of order, which is something that was implemented in CPU stuff a while back that was super, you know, performance improving. They have this now here, which can improve ray tracing speed up to 2 to 3 times faster and can result in 25% overall gaming performance increases, which is pretty awesome. And then they have new RT cores in general that do 2 times the ray triangle intersection throughput as previous cores, which just means it runs 2 times faster for ray tracing, which is, if all of these numbers hold up, this is a massive leap. We'll see if it does, but if it does, especially in the games like Flight Sim and stuff like that they showed, this could be pretty big. But if you are having trouble running games at higher frame rates, DLSS can now help. Not just in upscaling your games from a lower resolution that's easier to run, but they have now implemented temporal frame rate interpolation through the form of some form of AI enhanced optical flow, which is basically like the FlowFrames app that I showed before, where it interpolates your frame rate using AI to improve your frame rates, where they were showing almost doubling the speed going from just running the game normally with no ray tracing to running the game with ray tracing and the new DLSS 3.0 on, and it is pretty spectacular. This is the first DLSS update that really requires new hardware because of all the changes, so that's interesting. But also my big concern is going to be latency. It's apparently tied into Nvidia Reflex, so it's supposed to keep latency down. But you think about it in terms of a first-person shooter and stuff, you're acting based on the information, and if it's making up information and, you know, interjecting that before the real information gets to you, I still think there's some potential for concern. That is my only real concern here. Otherwise, we've been asking for DLSS-based frame rate interpolation for a while, so I'm very excited to see how believable it is in action. We also got some gaming-related announcements that are very exciting. They made a RTX remaster mod for the original Portal that's available for free, which is freaking awesome. They made it with Nvidia Omniverse. And then they also are releasing an entire software suite called RTX Remix, which allows you to take your old DirectX 8 and DirectX 9 games and it uses DXVK to actually upconvert them to their new shader and universal file format. And then you can go in with AI-assisted tools and convert the materials and the lighting and the shaders and stuff to run with ray tracing enabled, which is pretty spectacular. This is a pretty big leap. This means anyone will be able to do it. It won't be just like a flip of a switch. It's like, oh, I want to play this game with RTX. Let's just convert it to RTX. Like, it won't be a push button solution, but it opens the tools up to the community to be able to do it, and to do it on a much easier scale than say something like Quake 2 RTX, where it's like, let's just replace and re-encode the entire, reprogram the entire lighting and render engine. You now have tools that kind of abstract it from the original game and make it a mod. So we are going to see a ton of older games getting ray tracing support soon, and the quality won't always be amazing, but when you do get the right teams, I'm sure that, like with all mod teams, there will be a mod team that like specializes in it, or even the developers themselves may just take their hands at it and release free updates or whatever. That's going to be really freaking cool, and the fact that they're just handing off those tools to everyone is pretty baller. There was also an announcement of the new Ada Lovelace base, that's the architecture name, RTX A6000 GPU with 48 gigabytes of VRAM. Whew, I wish I could get my hands on that for all the AI stuff. But they spent a lot of time talking about AI workflows, robotics, and the use of Omniverse. Whenever they first started advertising Omniverse during these events, it was mostly like, hey, you can kind of loop into game engines and make machinima with it. And now they're saying that companies use it, like, I think it was Charter uses it to simulate their 5G, satellite and cell phone antenna rollouts to make sure that their coverage areas are correct. Lowe's uses it to simulate aisle placements and to optimize, user flows in that regard, that it's used in robotics and all sorts of stuff. So now Omniverse has gone from like, hey, you can make machinima with it, to this full just 3D simulation platform to do anything and everything. And so I'm downloading it today and finally like jumping into it. I've poked at it once or twice, but it's always been one of those things where I needed time to sit down and play with it. So I think this is gonna be an opportunity way out of the scope for me to even begin to explain in this video, but it's basically just a big simulation framework for all sorts of VR and 3D, simulation that I don't think we've really seen before at this scale, especially since it seems to be able to just do anything and everything, which is wild. I'm gonna end this before we talk about my concluding thoughts on the pricing in this. I'm gonna end this with the fact that I still think Jensen was AI rendered for at least part of this presentation. There were little cues in how the lighting on his kicker light changed and the weird compression on his face, even though he was on a black background and should have had all the bits associated with him. I'm beginning to wonder if he's been presenting as an AI generated character for maybe even a couple of these sessions now. There's always been the rumors, but this was one of the ones where I was convinced that might be what was going on. But overall, prices are really high. We're still seeing GPU prices go up, and it is reasonable to argue that perhaps they're still increasing prices because crypto has gone down, that Nvidia just wants to keep that profit margin going. But also, if it's as big of a leap as it seems to be, it's not entirely that unreasonable. They are launching with the higher end cards first, so they did push the 3000 series is still gonna be here. Buy those if you need cheaper ones. I understand a lot of the frustration. It's one of those things where if gaming performance is all you care about and you're not even gonna run ray tracing, I guess, then it's understandable that these prices just seem absurd and you want nothing to do with them. But for someone who's involved in all of this, in the AI, in the content creation, in the streaming, in all of these little things that they're doing now and becoming more so on a basically daily basis, it kind of just makes me sit there and wonder what is AMD even doing now? Because yeah, they provide great value for gaming, and although their prices keep going up as well, perhaps not at the rate that Nvidia's does, but they don't offer everything else. Their ray tracing performance still lacks. Their background removal software, which I still haven't covered, basically turns your voice into a phone call. It drops it to 16 kilohertz. It's awful. AMD is getting left so far in the dust in terms of workstation class that I think if anything, I'm presenting this as if you would think my take would be the only option is Nvidia, and for my work, that is mostly the case. But I think we're gonna see an even more bigger divide where the gamers end up more and more pushed to AMD's camp because of the pricing and because of the focus on just gaming. AMD's still doing a lot with their FSR stuff now. It launched kind of funny, but they're doing a lot with it now. I think we're gonna see Nvidia pushing more and more, especially with the EVGA news. If you missed it, EVGA is no longer making GPUs at all because they left Nvidia. They're just not gonna deal with it anymore. Nvidia is apparently really hard to work with. With all of that, I think we're gonna see Nvidia push more and more into this all-encompassing, focus on the workstation, creator studio, laptop, all-encompassing solution. And the gamers that just want to buy a graphics card for their scrappy little gaming rig and run games and click heads are gonna move more to AMD. And that's really interesting to see. I am fascinated by looking at what the next few years of the graphics market will like end up being, because as much as for my work, I'm like, this is the best thing ever. AMD, what the hell are you doing? I think for a lot of gamers, especially since the presentation here spent so much time on everything else, gamers are probably gonna start to feel kind of alienated, kind of left out. And that's not unreasonable. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below or on our Discord server, discord.gg/EposVox. Don't worry about the background. My studio renovations have taken 3 times as long as I expected now, and I just wanted to get this video out to talk to you all. We got more information coming, and I'll get my hands on the card and start covering it ASAP. Remember to be kind, rewind.